You have probably heard me mention it before. My best LARP purchase ever. The fabric that I'm probably most happy about that I bought it. So let me explain what that's all about. This is a 1.50 m by 1.50 m piece of wool. I bought it about 8 years back when I was still a student. At that time, this was relatively expensive for my budget, but by now it has definitely paid back for itself. It has kept me warm and dry through so many LARP days and nights. And yes, this is a cape. This square piece of wool is a finished cape. And there was no structural sewing involved at all. So, let me show you how I use it. The only extra accessory you need for this is a pin. Personally, I use a fibula, but you can use any other kind of pin you want. It's a nice bonus if it's easy to open and close. To actually wear the cape, all I do is keep the piece of fabric folded in half. I wrap it around my shoulders. I put the pin in the front. And the cape is done. Draped over my shoulders like this, it's just a nice warm and comfy cape. It will keep the warmth in, and because it is wool, it will also keep me dry in a drizzle. But like this, if I were to go into combat, the cape actually gets in the way of my hands. So when I played the character that actually wore the cape like this and I went into combat, all I did was flop these over my shoulders. And I've got full range of my hands again. Like this, even in combat. My back will stay nice and warm and also dry against the rain. But still, I've got full range of motion and can do with my hands whatever I want. Similarly, in case it started to rain more, because the cape is folded double right now, we can basically open it up and treat it again as if it was a single piece of fabric. I can then drape this over my head, and like this, I've also got a hood against the rain. If I want to, I can even add this to the pin to make sure it stays closed. Like this, I'm still nice and covered in the back. It's still really warm because it is a good quality wool. And yeah, this is basically how I use this square piece of fabric. In the beginning, I said my student budget wasn't really happy with this. But now that I look back, I actually realized that even that, it wasn't too bad. Yes, if you look at good quality wools like this and compare it in the price per meter compared to other fabrics, yes, it will be more expensive. But if you look at ready-made, fully good quality woolen capes, they will still be a lot more expensive than 1.5 meters of just plain wool. As I said, it's super multifunctional. Because it is just 1.5 meters of wool, I also use it as a blanket at night when it's cold. I take it to every LARP I go to, regardless whether I'm a player or an NPC. Because this is a relatively plain fabric, it will suit pretty much every character. I've also taken this to sci-fi LARP when I was an NPC. I mean, slightly more natural types, in this case slightly more hippie types. Nearly everything can benefit from this. And as you might have noticed, yes, there was some sewing in this cape. The edges of the fabric weren't cut perfectly straight, so I opted to go for a decorative stitch on the edges. Again, this fabric does not fray by itself, so it is not necessary. I merely added it because I thought it looked nicer. And that was pretty much all I think that I can tell you about my best LARP purchase ever. But there are more ways to make super easy capes. So let me show you another one. This is the cape that I currently use for the Fantasy Ranger costume. This is a 1.10 m by 1.20 m piece of fabric in which I cut 2 slits for the arms and slightly reinforced the ends of the armholes just to make sure that it wouldn't rip. The idea on how we wear this is put our arms through the slits, put a belt on the entire thing, and it's done. This style of cape is slightly more decorative compared to the previous one, especially considering it doesn't cover the shoulders. Yet, as it does still cover the entire back, if you use a fabric that doesn't let wind through, it can still be a really nice addition to your costume. Aside from that, this kind of cape can also be used just as a decorative layer. If at the moment all you have is a plain shirt and a plain pair of trousers, this kind of cape can add just that bit of interest. I mean, you don't even have to make it from windbreaking fabric. Make it from any kind of fabric you want, just as it looks interesting. And when it gets cold at night and you want something really nice and warm, why not use both? You can use it like this with any kind of fabric during the day, and then at night use the double folded wool over this. I mean, LARP and layers, they're very, very good friends. But as this kind of cape does involve a bit more thinking than the previous one, how do you actually make it? First of all, we're going to need some measurements. The easiest to start with is the length. Put on the clothing that you want to wear under the cape. Then measure from your armpit to where you want your cape to end. For me, this was around 80 centimeters. After that, put the measuring tape in your armpit, roughly where the side seam of your shirt is. Throw it over your shoulder and measure to the shoulder seam. If you're using a non-stretch fabric, add 1 or 2 centimeters. This is the length of the slit that you are going to cut for your armhole. Then add somewhere between 5 and 10 centimeters above the slit. These 3 measurements together form the length of your fabric you will need. For the width of the fabric, you measure the distance between your shoulders. Measure from the sleeve seam on your shirt to the sleeve seam on the other side. If you are using a non-stretch fabric, again add 1 or 2 centimeters. The last measurement is one of preference. How far from the armhole do you want your cape to end? Making this longer means more drape or overlap. I ended up going for 30 centimeters. Those 2 measurements added form the total width of the fabric you will need. For me, this was 1 meter. After cutting the rectangle, fold the fabric double, mark where your armhole should be and cut it open. Then grab a bit of thread and just like you would sew on a button, sew over the edges of the armhole to reinforce it to make sure it won't tear. And with that, your cape is done. Though for good measurements, you can dirty up the bottom edge for the proper weathered look. For this type of cape, I do recommend getting a fabric that does not need the edges finished because it saves you the, actual sewing on the armholes, front and bottom edge of the cape. Aside from that, I also think having visibly finished edges doesn't really fit the kind of rougher characters I usually make these capes for. And as you can see, these kind of capes combined with some simple clothing can already make for a pretty nice basis for a costume. I just pulled some random stuff from the closet, but if you add a hat or maybe some accessories for this, I can pretty much see this being a nice starting point for an actual character costume. And if you're wearing this and it gets cold at night, just add the other cape, layer them up. And there you have it, 2 pretty much no-sew capes. Whether you're a beginner just getting started or an experienced sewist just looking to add an easy extra layer of warmth, these capes are perfect. As usual, if you have any questions, don't hesitate to ask them in the comments below. If you're looking for more beginner sewing projects, you can check out this video. If you want to see more of me, you can subscribe. And if you really like what I'm doing, you can give me a small donation towards craft supplies. My Ko-fi link is in the description below. And with that, thank you all for watching and see you guys next time.